This is Time and Other Thieves, reflections and conversations on the nature of existence. I'm Sarah B. This episode originally aired in radio format on November 17th, 2022. I'm publishing it here in podcast format on November 7th, 2025. I was inspired to edit this episode into podcast format when a fellow Masters of Group Therapy Club member recently talked about the appeal of smoking cigarettes, something she herself has never done, and with Joan Didion in mind, said, "Serious women smoke." Well, regardless of how true that statement is, I love it, and it immediately brought to mind another Joan, Roberta Joan Anderson, a.k.a. Joni Mitchell, who smoked for much of her life and is still, indeed, a serious woman. Today is her 82nd birthday. Happy birthday, dear Joni. The radio version of this episode originally aired in 2 parts, but for this podcast version, I've edited it down to 1. I've hesitated to make it into a podcast at all because so much is lost in the conversion. The beauty of radio is that you can play songs without getting permission from the artist or label. So in the radio broadcast of this episode, I not only played all the songs on Joni Mitchell's For the Roses album, but also various clips of other songs off other albums, which you won't get to experience here. But you can at least listen to For the Roses on your own. If you don't have a copy, it's available on YouTube and Spotify. Now you're going to hear my voice from 3 years ago. Enjoy. Today's episode will be the first of 2 that are going to focus on Joni Mitchell's album For the Roses, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this month. It was released on November 21st, 1972. And Joni herself celebrated her 79th birthday this month on the 7th. Back in January of 2018, I gave an in-person lecture on For the Roses as part of Asheville FM's Music Matters series, and I thought it would be fun to revive that lecture in radio format. Time and Other Thieves is named after one of Joni's song lyrics, after all, from Furry Sings the Blues, and she is one of my greatest heroes. As a child whose parents both loved Joni Mitchell, my first introduction to her, perhaps while I was still in utero, was probably her fabulous live album from 1974, Miles of Aisles. Or, just as likely, it may have been her album Court and Spark, also from 1974. Those 2 albums were all I knew of Joni Mitchell's music, the only CDs of hers my parents ever played, and all I felt the need to know, because they satisfied me that greatly, until I was in 7th grade and my dad brought his vinyl collection down from the attic, a collection that included For the Roses. I don't have any clear memories of how it felt to see that album for the first time. Its cover so different from those of Miles of Aisles and Court and Spark, neither of which featured Joni's likeness, whereas here she was barefaced and seated near the edge of a cliff, dressed in green velvet. And I also can't recall what all I felt when listening to it for the first time. But I know that whatever I felt was something I wanted to feel again and again, because I proceeded to listen to it again and again, so much so that it now feels like it's always been a part of me. To borrow a phrase from Joni's Case of You off the album Blue, which I wouldn't discover on my own until I was a senior in high school, believe it or not, the songs on For the Roses are In My Blood Like Holy Wine. I feel a kinship with one YouTube commenter who wrote in 2015, "Play this album quietly right before you go to sleep. Lay there in the dark and listen. Play it a lot. Play it till it's in your DNA, because that's where it belongs." I can't say that For the Roses is my favorite Joni Mitchell album, because my love for it finds rivals in my love for the 2 I'd come to know so well before ever hearing it, and for Blue. But it's definitely in my top 4. And my love for it is definitely different in quality than my love for the other 3, because unlike the others, For the Roses provided the soundtrack for a very dark period in my life. And I mean dark literally as well as figuratively. It was the album that I always listened to while doing sit-ups and leg lifts in my darkened bedroom every night. See, when I was 12, I developed an eating disorder, only allowing myself 10 grams of fat a day, and an exercise addiction. The nightly sit-ups and leg lifts were the most potent symptom of that addiction. I did them in the dark because I got tired of seeing my surroundings, how the ceiling and walls would advance and recede with each sit-up. I can picture myself spreading a towel on the floor for cushioning. The bones of my spine had started to chafe against the carpet. Turning on the stereo, placing the needle on the outer glossy rim of vinyl, killing the lights, and lying down as this song started to play. In the radio version of this episode, I now played the opening track, Banquet, which I encourage you to check out on your own now. Kenneth Altshuler of the Michigan Daily called it her best social commentary since Fiddle and the Drum. When Joni speaks of starving, she makes you feel the hunger in her pounding notes and striving lyrics. It only occurs to me now how ironic it is that I would always listen to Banquet, and the songs that followed it, while doing secret sit-ups and leg lifts in the dark as a 12 and 13-year-old, after yet another day of depriving myself of the nutrients my growing body needed, because the song is about people not having enough food. Well, it's about how some people have too much while others have too little. In the first verse, Joni sings, "Come to the dinner gong, the table is laden high. Fat bellies and hungry little ones, tuck your napkins in and take your share. Some get the gravy and some get the gristle. Some get the marrow bone and some get nothing, though there's plenty to spare." She ends the song in a similar vein, but with something like a call to action at the close. Who let the greedy in and who left the needy out? Who made this salty soup? Tell him we're very hungry now for a sweeter fare. In the Music Matters in-person version of this lecture, I played a clip at this juncture of an interview that Joni did with New York Times chief pop music critic John Perellis in 2013. Because Joni is so well known for her unique approach to playing the guitar, and Banquet is a piano-based tune, I thought people might like to hear her talk about the piano some. Due to copyright laws, I cannot play that interview clip here on the radio, but you can check it out on your own by going to YouTube and searching for Joni Mitchell and Brian Blade interview, Time Talks Luminato, and I will gladly summarize it for you. Gladly, because that means I have a reason to watch the interview again, and I love watching Joni talk. She is hands down my favorite talker of all time. In the clip in question, she recalls hearing Rachmaninoff for the first time when she was 8 years old, and having the realization that music spoke straight to the emotions. She describes it as a tender entreaty on the music's part, asking her to understand it better. The young Joni begged her mother for piano lessons, and her mother obliged. Joni was taught to play with her left hand, and then with her right hand, and by the end of the year she had put both hands together for a recital. After that recital, she wrote her first song, Robin Walk, which had no lyrics. She played it proudly for her teacher, whose response was to smack Joni on the back of her hand with a ruler and say, "Why would you want to play by ear when you could have the masters under your fingers?" And Joni responded to that by quitting her piano lessons. In the Perellis interview, she jokes about how her mother thought of her as a quitter from that day forward. Even in her 80s, decades into her daughter's career as a famous musician, she bemoaned, "All that money we spent on your piano lessons, and you quit!" But the grown-up Joni is glad she never got the masters under her fingers, because then whatever shapes her fingers made on the piano were her very own, what she describes as virginal. Joni Mitchell was born Roberta Joan Anderson on November 7th, 1943, in Alberta, Canada. Due to her father being a Royal Canadian Air Force flight lieutenant, the family, Joni was an only child, lived on various bases in Western Canada before settling down, after the war ended, in Saskatchewan when Joni was 9. That was the same year that she contracted polio and spent many solitary weeks in the hospital, where she promised God that if she recovered, she would go to church every Sunday. She did recover, And she did go to church, which is where, ironically enough, some girls introduced her to tobacco, and she instantly fell in love with smoking. "My head cleared up," she later said of nicotine's effect on her. "I seemed to see better and think better." She would continue to be a heavy smoker for most of the rest of her life. I'm pretty sure she didn't quit until March of 2015, when she suffered a brain aneurysm rupture that left her so physically compromised she couldn't smoke. Damn aneurysms, ruining everyone's fun. I always admired Joni's relationship to smoking, how unapologetic she was about it. She once said that everyone should smoke cigarettes, so they might see better and think better too. As a teenager, years after her aborted piano lessons, Joni bought a ukulele, and soon after that she taught herself to play the guitar. More on that later. In 1964, at 19 years old, she matriculated at Alberta College of Art in Calgary, where she remained for 1 year. During that year, she began performing traditional folk songs at a club called The Depression. Calgary was also where she met Brad Moochie McMath, and soon became pregnant with his child. They moved to Toronto together, but Moochie didn't last long. Joni kept performing at clubs and eventually gave birth to Kelly Dale Anderson on February 19th, 1965. She was penniless and therefore forced to put her baby into foster care. The following month, she met and married the folk musician Chuck Mitchell, who promised Joni they'd raise Kelly together. But he lied, and Joni had to give Kelly up for adoption. In October of 1965, she had her television debut on the Canadian show Let's Sing Out. A young Dave Van Ronk was there also. You can watch it on YouTube. Still going by Joni Anderson, Joni hadn't found her name yet or her voice. She sang "Me and My Uncle" in a high, constricted-sounding pitch. If you watch her performance on Let's Sing Out from the following year, 1966, you'll notice a big difference. Not only is she singing her own song, Night in the City, but she's also showcasing her lower range abilities and her knack for going from very low to very high very quickly. And somehow, even more so than in her 1965 performance, she is insanely pretty. In June of 1966, Joni moved with Chuck to New York City, where they performed as a duo at the Gaslight. It was around this time that she wrote the song Little Green about her daughter, which would appear on her album Blue 5 years later. In early 1967, when Joni was 24, the couple divorced. That was also the year that Tom Rush and Buffy St. Marie recorded Joni's song The Circle Game, which was her answer to Neil Young's Sugar Mountain. Buffy's version became a hit, and listeners began to wonder about the name behind the song. The following year, Joni wrote Both Sides Now, which she played for the musician and record producer Al Kooper, who then made her play it for Judy Collins, who instantly recorded it along with 2 other Joni songs. Collins's version of Both Sides Now sold 1 million copies and became a top 10 hit. It would take another 6 years for Joni to have her own top 10 single with Help Me from Court and Spark. In March of 1968, she signed a record deal with the Reprise label. Elliot Roberts was her manager, and David Crosby produced her debut album, Song to a Seagull. In an interview she did in 1998, Joni said that those early songs were not rooted in folk, but rather in classical music. More on that later, too. Her sophomore release, Clouds, dropped in May of 1969, which was followed about a year later by Ladies of the Canyon, which was followed 14 months later by Blue, and about a year and a half later, For the Roses happened, in November of 1972. It was her first album on David Geffen's new label, Asylum. Let's hear the second track now. Or rather, you pause me and go give it a listen on your own. It's called Cold Blue Steel and Sweet Fire. A title that evokes, to quote Stephen Davis at Rolling Stone, the apparatus and taste of smack. More on that in a minute. In the biography he wrote about Joni in 2017, called Reckless Daughter, David Yaffe says that For the Roses has not achieved the canonical status of its predecessor, Blue, perhaps because it was even more emotionally exhausting. It was also tougher, which tested those for whom defenselessness was a virtue. Yaffe also calls it a watershed album, not only because it's a bridge between two masterpieces, referring to Blue and Court and Spark. He says in it, you can hear that she is changing, you can sense her mind growing muscles, and by the time For the Roses was released, even the establishment journalists were getting it. Just because Joni's music was personal did not mean it wasn't powerful. Joni herself said before she went in to record the album that at one time she'd considered some of its songs too personal, too close to her life to ever present to the public. Lucky for us, she changed her mind. In her review of the album, New Yorker magazine music critic Ellen Willis described For the Roses as an elaboration of Blue, both technically and thematically, and is in some ways even finer. Unfortunately, it is also less accessible. Joni's melodies and lyrics and rhythms are so rich and complicated and un-pop song-like, her voice such a subtle instrument, her artistic pretension so overt that if the record were any less brilliant, it would be a disaster. Other reviewers from the time called it the strangest album she had ever done, described it as extremely difficult to review and as utterly unsettling, even disturbing. It's not for unsympathetic ears seeking melodic bliss. The album jangles the nerves with its sadness and undercurrent of strife. A journalist for the San Mateo Times wrote, "The songs on this album are not the sort you walk around humming to yourself. The melodies are too intricate, flowing for that, and sometimes almost too fragile for anyone's voice but hers." I must politely disagree here, as I've been humming and singing these songs to myself for decades, but I appreciate the point nonetheless. And Toby Goldstein at Words and Music said, "Selfishness, criminality, freedom are all fit themes for her now bittersweet voice. The sometimes shrieking indulgence of past years has all but vanished. Her voice is now captivating, weaving through her lyrics with discipline, stating exactly what she means with a deliberateness that is shocking." Joni said in a conversation with Barney Hoskins in 1994 that she could probably sing Cold Blue Steel and Sweet Fire better as an older woman. 22 years after recording it, she felt she'd developed more character in her voice, others might call it a smoker's rasp, and that her 1972 voice was miscast for that song, which is about the dark seduction of heroin. Joni herself never did heroin. She wound up being more of a cocaine fan, but she was around people, including James Taylor, who did it, and I'd say her song successfully captures the nightmarish desperation of that addiction. You can check out the lyrics for yourself. Jack Lloyd of the Philadelphia Inquirer called it a street song masterpiece, hauntingly beautiful, dark and ominous, scary as hell. The lines ooze with the pain of our times. Kenneth Altshuler of the Michigan Daily said, "Her downtrodden pace and taunting invitation to death makes you fear the power of the song as much as heroin." Altshuler also praised Cold Blue Steel and Sweet Fire for having the best guitar work on the album, provided by James Burton. But Burton only plays electric guitar in this song. That was him you heard riffing with Tommy Scott on what sounds like a soprano sax. James Burton, by the way, also played guitar with Graham Parsons. He is who Graham is talking to in Return of the Grievous Angel when he says, "Pick it for me, James." And I like the psychedelic electric guitar that Burton plays in Cold Blue Steel, but it's really Joni's acoustic guitar playing that stands out. As is the case in most of her songs, she's playing in what's called an open tuning here. Standard tuning, also referred to as concert tuning, is most people's method of tuning a guitar in accord with the entire orchestra. The 6 strings of the guitar are tuned in the following manner: E, A, D, G, B, E. But in Cold Blue Steel, Joni's guitar is tuned C, G, D, G, B, D, or what Joni would call C77543. According to her biographer David Yaffe, when Joni's songwriting started to take off in 1966, she took from various open tunings that already existed, then turned them into something that no one had heard before, and started writing songs primarily in open chords and dropped tunings. With these tunings, which would eventually number about 50, most listeners who knew nothing about the guitar were still hearing something utterly unlike anyone else's music. In that same interview I mentioned earlier with John Perellis in 2013, Joni talks about what people called her weird chords, but what she prefers to call chords of inquiry. They have question marks in them, she says, and her life was full of question marks. Her daughter, the Cold War, sudden illnesses, and also, because of the polio, Joni's left hand was weak, and the open tunings, though more complex and even baffling when transposed onto the page, were physically easier to play. She sure does make it sound easy, anyway. Okay, podcast listeners, at this point in the radio version, I played the third track on For the Roses, which is called Bar and Grill. Go give it a listen. Bar and Grill, all one word, no D, begins with the lines, 3 waitresses all wearing black diamond earrings, talking about zombies and Singapore slings. When I gave this For the Roses lecture in person in early 2018, I made a batch of zombies and Singapore slings and served them to any participants who were interested. They were pretty awesome, gotta say. Zombies are rum-based and Singapore slings are gin-based. Anyway, Joni goes on to sing of her 3 waitresses. No trouble in their faces, not one anxious voice, none of the crazy you get from too much choice. Stephen Davis of Rolling Stone magazine described Bar and Grill as lighter and a welcome break from the damnation of the preceding track, Cold Blue Steel and Sweet Fire. The wonderful folks at Wikipedia say of this song that Mitchell uses the hunt for an elusive roadside eatery as a metaphor for the quest to find herself. Or, I might say, to be ordinary and unpressured. Or, to find the ultimate ease and convenience that our culture worships, a place where everything is fast and worry-free. Our buddy Kenneth Altshuler from the Michigan Daily called this song, at the time of its release, filler material. He said, "The lyrics are insignificant, though poetic, and the music isn't aesthetically pleasing. It's just not that good." First of all, Ken, saying it's just not that good in a published music review, that's poor form. And second of all, how is the music in Bar and Grill not aesthetically pleasing? It's freaking delightful. And finally, did you read the lyrics, let alone really listen to them? It's impressive what Joni's doing on this level. She's telling a story with a beginning, middle, and satisfying end that is also rich with symbolism. Of one of the 3 aforementioned waitresses, possibly suggestive of some sort of trinity, Joni sings, "You think she knows something by the second refill. You think she's enlightened as she totals your bill. You say, 'Show me the way to Bar and Grill.'" In the second verse, our narrator is still in the diner, contemplating the waitress and thinking about how to get enlightened, find God, whatever you want to call it. She sings, "Some say it's in service. They say humble makes pure. You're hoping it's near folly, 'cause you're headed that way for sure. And you just have to laugh 'cause it's all so crazy. Her mind's on her boyfriend and eggs over easy. It's just a trick on you, her mirrors and your will. So you ask the truck driver on the way to the till, but he's just a slave to Bar and Grill." Now she's left the diner, and in the next verse, she's at a gas station. And the guy at the gas pump's got a lot of soul. He sings Merry Christmas for you just like Nat King Cole. And he makes up his own tune right on the spot about white walls and windshields and this job he's got. This guy's not looking for anything in particular, isn't a slave to any seeking, nor is he seemingly enlightened. But he's got a lot of soul, and in the presence of his soulful singing, our narrator gets lost in the moment. And in that lostness, as opposed to her previous mode of trying to find something, this elusive Bar and Grill, some longing gets filled. She even forgets to ask, "Hey, where's Bar and Grill?" Which is spelled, by the way, as one word, B-A-R-A-N-G-R-I-L-L. She forgets to ask because she's already there. Without seeking, she has found it by getting lost in the moment. And why did Joni call this idyllic destination Bar and Grill? I can only make a guess. For me, the grill part of the word evokes Shangri-La, a word that's become synonymous with any earthly paradise. But Joni's giving it an especially American or Western twist and leaving things open as to what it means exactly. It can mean different things for different people. The truck driver in the song, for instance, is a slave to Bar and Grill, so maybe for him an earthly paradise isn't especially spiritual. Maybe he's chasing some mirage of happiness that results from material pleasures, or drugs, or sex, or alcohol. He can't tell Joni how to find her Bar and Grill because hers is much different from his. But the guy at the gas pumps is making up his own tune right on the spot. He is fully embodied, fully himself, fully present to his life. That's what our narrator's really after. It's nothing anyone else can point her in the direction of. It's only something people can be. And in witnessing the gas pump guy be, she is able to be herself. I'm Sarah B., and I'll get into the next track on For the Roses now. So far, none of the songs we've heard have been terribly personal. Banquet was a social commentary, Cold Blue Steel was about heroin, which Joni never did herself, and Bar and Grill is more of a parable, told from the second-person point of view. The song you're about to hear, though, Lesson in Survival, is told in the first person, and it's obviously Joni herself, not some fictional narrator, doing the talking. Actually, the song does sound at the beginning like it's written in the second person, but in this case, she's actually referring to a separate you. The evidence for that comes when she says at the end of the first verse, "You need to believe in something once I could in our love." She later goes on to really own the first-person POV when she sings, "I know my needs, my sweet tumbleweed. I need more quiet times, by a river flowing, you and me, deep kisses, and the sun going down." Stephen Davis of Rolling Stone called this song so pretty and true it makes me want to jump out of my skin. And I bet it was at least partly this track that inspired Jack Lloyd of the Philadelphia Inquirer to say, "Much of the content on For the Roses is so scorchingly personal that one almost feels guilty of invasion of privacy." Please pause me now and listen to Lesson in Survival, which bleeds into the next track, Let the Wind Carry Me. I believe they should be listened to as a pair, so go ahead and indulge in both. Before moving on to the final track on side 1, which is also the title track, I want to provide a little more background information on what was going on for Joni while writing these songs. I mentioned the cover of For the Roses earlier, which is a photograph of Joni taken by Joel Bernstein, who's also behind well-known photos of Neil Young, Tom Petty, Bob Dylan, and Bruce Springsteen, among others. In the photo, Joni is sitting on the ground with her left elbow resting on her bent left knee, right forearm resting on right thigh, the fingers of each hand touching, possibly fiddling with a pebble or piece of grass. She is wearing dark green velvet pants and a matching velvet top, both of which she sewed herself, and knee-high brown suede boots. Her blonde hair falls long and straight, framing her unadorned face, the trademark high cheekbones and intelligent blue eyes. She's seated at the edge of a precipice, the earth dropping down just past her left toe to a lake or river that stretches out behind her. This is the wilderness of British Columbia, where Joni had purchased a piece of land and lived alone with kerosene, staying away from electricity for about a year. Not only was she escaping her relationship with James Taylor, more on that in a minute, but she was also escaping her own fame, which caught her off guard with the success of her 1971 album Blue. In a most wonderful documentary called Joni Mitchell, Woman of Heart and Mind, which my sister Emily gave me for Christmas many years ago and which I've now watched more times than I can count, an early aughts era Joni talks about the breakup with musician Graham Nash, which inspired a lot of the songs in Blue. Nash had asked Joni to marry him, and she really wanted to marry him, but she couldn't stop thinking about her maternal grandmother, who was a frustrated poet and musician who wound up kicking the kitchen door off the hinges, and her paternal grandmother, who wept for the last time in her life at 14 behind some barn because she wanted a piano, but said to herself, "Dry your eyes, you silly girl, you'll never have a piano." And Joni thought, Maybe I'm the one that got the gene that has to make it happen for these two women. It broke her heart to say no to Nash's proposal, but she didn't want to end up kicking the door off the hinges. The fact that she made the album Blue soon after that seems like pretty good solid proof that she made the right decision. Not that she was happy while making the album. In the Woman of Heart and Mind documentary, she says that she was so fragile and thin-skinned during that time that if anyone looked at her, she'd burst into tears. I felt so naked in my work, she says. My individual psychological descent coincided, ironically, with my ascent into the public eye. They were putting me on a pedestal and I was wobbling. So I took it upon myself that, since I was a public voice and was subject to this kind of weird worship, they should know who they were worshiping. And I love to death what she says next. She says, I was demanding of myself a deeper and greater honesty, more and more revelation in my work, in order to give it back to the people, where it goes into their lives and nourishes them and changes their direction and makes light bulbs go off in their head and makes them feel, and it isn't vague. It strikes against the very nerves of their life, and in order to do that, you have to strike against the very nerves of your own. Yes, yes, yes. I think it was about 10 years ago that I wrote that quote down on a scrap of paper, and I still have that scrap of paper in my desk for when I need some artistic inspiration and motivation, Joni style. Anyway, her Blue-related fame sent her into the Canadian backbush, where she went back to nature, or as she sings in her song Woodstock, back to the garden. As I mentioned earlier, she was also escaping her relationship with James Taylor. Here's what she herself had to say about that, as quoted in the biography Restless Daughter. James was in a bad place and it just didn't work. He'd gotten off heroin and was on methadone. He was broody and moody, and I was trying to be cheerful, which was really the wrong thing. You can't be self-destructive without destroying everything around you. If somebody's dark and brooding, you're better off brooding beside them. Don't go acting cheerful. You're just a reminder of what they're not, and they'll hate you for it. That's when I learned that lesson. And then I bought the property and spent a year up there and sealed myself from that. Alone in the BC wilderness, Joni was having what Westerners might call a nervous breakdown, but what other cultures would call a shamanic conversion. As she says in the Woman of Heart and Mind documentary, she read every psychological book she could get her hands on and threw them all against the wall, basically. But depression, she says, can be the sand that makes the pearl. Most of my best work came out of it. And here comes another quote I wrote down on that same scrap of paper. If you get rid of the demons and the disturbing things, then the angels fly off too. So there is a possibility in that mire of an epiphany. And in this case, that epiphany manifested in the form of a really good album. Let's hear the title track now, which I actually played a few weeks ago during my Artist's Way series when I was talking about fame. It's interesting to note here that the original cover of For the Roses was a cartoon of a horse's ass with a wreath around his neck and a big horse grin and a balloon coming out of his mouth that said, For the Roses, referring to how we say that racehorses run for the roses. And if they don't win, Joni would joke in a live performance, we'd take 'em out back and shoot 'em. That's how she felt about the music industry. She called the title track to For the Roses her first farewell to show business. But David Yaffe, founder and head of the Asylum label, wouldn't let her use the cartoon horse as the cover. And I'm glad about that, as I much prefer the Joel Bernstein photo. There was a period in which Joni wanted to use another Bernstein photo of herself for the cover. In this one, she was standing naked on a rock with her back to the camera, one knee cocked like Botticelli's Venus as she gazed out at a vast body of water. But this time it was her manager, Elliot Roberts, who urged her not to use that image for the cover. It was a very tasteful nude, yes, but still, Roberts pointed out that there were going to be price stickers on it in every record store. Joan, he said, how would you like to see $5.98 plastered across your ass? That convinced her, and she decided the inner gatefold of For the Roses was the best place for the nude. Music critic Penny Valentine, writing at the time of the album's release, said, Written ostensibly for James Taylor, the title track displays a careful, studied, and yet emotional outlook on how people approach, use, and fling away the artist and their work when material success falls off. And Bruce Kirkland of the Toronto Star described it as offering witty yet bitter comments on the transience of both love and the vicious music world where idols are built in weeks, smashed in days. So here it is, the title track and closing track to side one of the album For the Roses by Joni Mitchell. As I said, Penny Valentine called that song a careful, studied, and yet emotional outlook on how people approach, use, and fling away the artist and their work when material success falls off. And in this case, the artist in question was supposedly James Taylor, who, by the way, played guitar in the songs All I Want, California, Carrie, and A Case of You on Blue. But when I researched Taylor online, I learned that his material success had yet to fall off at all when Joni wrote the song For the Roses. His critical and popular breakthrough, Sweet Baby James, was released in February of 1970. In March of 1971, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine as the face of new rock. And a month later, his album Mudslide Slim and the Blue Horizon was released, which contained Taylor's biggest hit single in the U.S., a version of Carole King's new You've Got a Friend, featuring backing vocals by Joni Mitchell, which reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in late July. Mudslide Slim also contained the song You Can Close Your Eyes, which he wrote for Joni. More on that later. It wasn't until November of 1972, the same month that For the Roses was released, so well after Joni had written the title track, that Taylor's music garnered a lukewarm reception with the album One Man Dog, but that album still made the top 10 on the Billboard charts. So I could see how For the Roses, the song, is about Taylor in as much as it's about having your name in the news and everything first class, but not so much when it comes to the part about artists getting crucified. There's that line near the end where Joni sings, "Oh, the power and the glory," just when you're getting that taste for worship, they start bringing out their hammers and their boards and their nails. The next song on For the Roses, though, which is the first song on side 2, is also ostensibly addressed to Taylor, and I see no reason to think otherwise. She even refers to his suspenders, which he wears proudly on the cover of Mudslide Slim. I love this song. It's Joni Mitchell's See You Sometime. Addressing her former lover, James Taylor, Joni sings, "Pack your suspenders, I'll come meet your plane. No need to surrender, I just want to see you again." She refers to her solitary life in the BC wilderness when she says, "I run in the woods, I spring from the boulders like a mama lion," and when she refers to needing some sunshine on her apple trees. She also references the reason why she's alone in the woods, namely to escape her own fame, singing, "I couldn't take them all on then, with a head full of questions and hypes, so when the hopes got so slim, I just resigned." In 2007, For the Roses was one of 25 recordings chosen that year by the Library of Congress to be added to the National Recording Registry. It was Joni's first and only album to accomplish that feat. It is an album that, to quote Mike O'Connor of the Journal News, writing at the time of its release, demands complete attention. And I agree with what one YouTube commenter said about it in 2017. Quote, "I've never heard a voice like hers and all the tracking she does and overlays. I find it like flowers singing. It's a thing to try to bend down to." As I shared last week, I bent down to this album almost every night for about a year, the same amount of time that Joni lived alone in the Canadian backbush, and lying on the floor as it played on vinyl in order to do the sit-ups and leg lifts that were an integral part of the exercise addiction I was beholden to at 12 and 13 years of age. For the Roses was the soundtrack to one of my life's darkest periods. Joni herself might say the same thing of the album. But she also said, as I mentioned last week, that depression can be the sand that makes the pearl. She said that some of her best work came out of it. For the Roses is a prime example of that. The next song on the album is called Electricity, and in it, Joni compares the flow of love's energy to an electrical current. Stephen Davis of Rolling Stone called it a short-circuited affair of the heart that says often people think of themselves unconsciously as machines. At this juncture in the in-person lecture I gave on For the Roses in 2018, I shared a clip from what is probably my favorite Joni Mitchell interview ever. Like the interview I referenced in last week's episode, this one is also from 2013, given in advance of a tribute concert that took place at the Illuminate Festival at Massey Hall in Toronto. You can find it by searching Joni Mitchell CBC interview. Its official name on YouTube is The Joni Mitchell Interview. She's wearing a green blouse and her hair is piled on her head in elegant swoops and folds. The interviewer is Gian Gomeshi. In the part of the interview I shared in my original Music Matters lecture, Gomeshi asks Joni why she doesn't have, and doesn't want, the internet or email in her life. There are lots of reasons for it, she says. First of all, it's a trap. It's Big Brother waiting to spring. So there is an element of folly. She adds, at a time when we should be cutting back on electricity, we're sucking more and more. Not to mention ease, the opposite of dis-ease, is created in the holy spots. If people were sensitive, they would know that our ionization is just nuts. Whales are getting the bends because of sonar and all the activity down there. Whales know how to surface without destroying their bones, but because of the electrical activity of our stupid inventions, when you see 56 whales beaching themselves, that's electronic noise. We are being driven mad by cell phones and satellites and everything, and we don't even take that into consideration. So it's like DDT. It's an evil thing, really, in the big picture. Here she holds up her hands. I know that there's wonderful things it can do. Gomeshi eagerly offers exploring creativity, exploring musicians from around the world. You don't need it for that, Joni says. And you've got attention deficit push-button people. No, there's more malformation taking place, even down to bookkeeping, white-collar crime potential. It's really just further extension of our insanity as a species. It's a tragic little culture. They love it, but in the big picture, in the future, there's terrible consequences for it. I shared that clip in person, and now quote it for you in preparation for hearing the song Electricity, whose lyrics evoke some of what Joni was just saying in the lines, I'm learning it's peaceful with a good dog and some trees, out of touch with the breakdown of the century. They're not gonna fix it up too easy. And if it were too easy, Lord knows that would just create more problems, since, as Joni was suggesting, our quest for ever more ease has ultimately created more dis-ease in our society. There's also another James Taylor reference in this song, but I'll talk about that after you've listened to it. In the final verse of Electricity, Joni sings, she holds out her candle and she shines it in, and she begs him to show her how to fix it again, while the song that he sang her to soothe her to sleep runs all through her circuits like a heartbeat. The he in question there is James Taylor, whom Joni dated for about a year before secluding herself in the BC wilderness to escape his broody moodiness and her own fame. The song in question is You Can Close Your Eyes from his Mudslide Slim album. In the radio version of this episode, I now played the first verse and chorus, which I highly recommend you listen to now, as it's quite beautiful. According to iTunes, that song is the most popular on Mudslide Slim, even more so than You've Got a Friend. According to Far Out magazine, Taylor wrote, You Can Close Your Eyes in an Albuquerque hotel room following a visit from Joni during the filming of a movie called Two-Lane Blacktop. While his acting debut was a hellish experience for Taylor, the time he shared with Joni in the Southwest was priceless and inspired him to create the track. Back to For the Roses. Robert Kreisgau of Newsday wrote at the time of its release that For the Roses has none of the ingratiating ease of Blue. There's nothing bright and lively, nothing good time. I'd argue that the song we just heard was pretty bright and lively, as was one of the tracks we heard last week, Bar and Grill, but overall it is a rather serious-sounding album. Kreisgau went on to say, Mitchell's line has become so sinuous and complex that the melodies lack first-time appeal. Those I-ams are gone forever. In another artist, such foreboding music might even hint at elitism, but it so happens that Joni's biggest single on the record has gone top 10. That single was You Turn Me On, I'm a Radio, which I'd also argue is pretty bright and lively. And to be clear, it went top 10 in Canada, her first song to do that, and reached number 25 on the American Billboard Hot 100 charts, her first top 40 hit released under her own name. You might recall from last week that Judy Collins' version of Joni's Both Sides Now reached top 10 in 1968. She herself would not have a top 10 hit in the States until 1974 with the song Help Me from Court and Spark. Joni wrote You Turn Me On, I'm a Radio explicitly to appease her manager, Elliot Roberts, who wanted her to write a hit. So Joni appealed directly to disc jockeys with references to radio stations and broadcasting towers and transistors, static and bad reception. Stephen Davis of Rolling Stone called the track Simply Stone Great, an example of her rollicking and rarely used humor, a rock and roll ditty that is a breath of sea air in her occasionally Dickinsonian parlor. Ellen Willis of the New Yorker magazine called it an irresistible tour de force, a metaphysical poem based on the crucial technological metaphor of rock and roll. And Lawrence Gilbert, writing for a publication out of the University of Michigan, said, This song is quintessential Joni Mitchell, the sort of song her voice and sense of rhythm and music playing are best suited for. Speaking of rhythm, I should mention here that Bobby Hall provides percussion on this track. Ms. Hall started her studio career in Detroit as Motown's youngest session musician, developing long-standing relationships with such greats as Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, the Jackson 5, the Temptations, Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, Bob Dylan, and many others. You can learn more about her approach to playing percussion with various musicians, including Joni, in a YouTube video called Liner Note Legends No. 4, Ms. Bobby Hall. And the harmonica in this track is provided by Joni's former boyfriend and almost fiancé, Graham Nash. Enjoy. That was the lead single and Joni's first top 10 hit in Canada, her first top 40 hit in the U.S., You Turn Me On, I'm a Radio. I'm going to move right into the next song now, Blonde in the Bleachers. Stephen Stills of Crosby, Stills and Nash is credited in the liner notes as being the rock and roll band on this track, meaning that he plays all the instruments in the final verse and outro, except, I assume, the saxophone, which would be Tommy Scott. Russ Kunkel also plays some drums on this track. Kunkel is a session musician who's worked with Jackson Browne, Jimmy Buffett, Harry Chapin, Neil Diamond, Bob Dylan, Stevie Nicks, Stephen Winwood, Neil Young, and many others. But back to Stephen Stills. According to Jerry A. Coyne, Ph.D. and Emeritus Professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Chicago, who has a blog called Why Evolution is True and wrote a post about Stills called Captain Manyhands, Blonde in the Bleachers is almost certainly about Stills. He and Joni were never more than friends. He first met David Crosby and Graham Nash at a party at Joni's house, but he was a charismatic male rock star with many groupies, and this is a song about the difficulty one faces in holding on to a free-spirited rock and roll man. And here's a fun fact about Stephen Stills that I didn't know until doing research for this episode. He played guitar on the Bill Withers song, Ain't No Sunshine. In Joni's Blonde in the Bleachers, his contribution starts right after the line, She tapes her regrets to the microphone stand. Joni Mitchell getting by with a little help from her friend Stephen Stills on Blonde in the Bleachers. That's the 10th track on her 1972 album For the Roses. As I've mentioned, I gave an in-person lecture on For the Roses back in January of 2018 as part of Asheville FM's Music Matters series. At this juncture in that lecture, I played another clip from my favorite Joni interview, which she gave in 2013. The interviewer, Jian Gomeshi, asks if it's true that she's always had a distaste for being referred to as a confessional songwriter. I shared this clip and will summarize it for you now because the next track off For the Roses, Woman of Heart and Mind, is quite likely a song that could be pigeonholed as confessional, as she is so clearly singing about herself right out of the gate with the lines, "I am a woman of heart and mind with time on her hands, no child to raise." In her response to Gomeshi, though, Joni references the lyrics from her song River off of Blue, in which she sings, "I'm so hard to handle, I'm selfish and I'm sad." "What did I confess to?" she asks Gomeshi. "I'm selfish? My generation is the most selfish generation in history. What is so confessional? I'm sad? Oh geez, have you never been sad?" She goes on to say that confession in this culture is either in church and it's a sin, or it's being whipped out of you in the police station. She references the Confessions of St. Augustine and how his writings were the first of their kind and how personal they were, written in the first person to his God. Joni also points out that, except for when writing a song and singing it for the first couple of times maybe, she is method acting whenever she sings. She's not really feeling that pain or whatever it might be all over again. She's playing a part. Art is short for artificial, she says. She talks about Van Gogh's paintings and how his landscapes are exaggerated to make the emotional experience of them, quote, realer for the deadened. It's a lie to get you to see the truth. And that's what all art is. And at the same time, Joni prides herself on being honest. She tells Gomeshi that she's heard people lump her in with the confessional poets, Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, the former of which she considers morbid, and the latter she considers a liar, citing that Sexton lied to her psychiatrist. "I don't like being on that list with those women," she says. "I don't think they're as honest as I am." Some might argue that Joni is arrogant in saying this, and they might be right. The thing I love most about her is that she isn't perfect and doesn't presume to be. It is so refreshingly honest, her saying that she doesn't think Plath or Sexton are as honest as she is. And indeed, the you she is addressing in Woman of Heart and Mind is also someone whose honesty and authenticity she questions. "All this talk about holiness now," she sings. "It must be the start of the latest style. Is it all books and words, or do you really feel it? Do you really laugh? Do you really care? Do you really smile when you smile?" As you listen to this song, notice the percussion, courtesy again of Miss Bobby Hall, and notice the bass guitar, courtesy of Wilton Felder, best known as the founding member of the Jazz Crusaders. Felder also played bass on the Jackson 5's hits I Want You Back and ABC, and on Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On. And here's Joni Mitchell doing the second to last track on For the Roses, Woman of Heart and Mind. I once wrote that last line down on a scrap of paper and gave it to a boy I had a crush on in 7th grade. "You know the times you impress me most are the times when you don't try." I'm pretty sure that boy thought I was weird. Stephen Davis of Rolling Stone called the song we just heard, Woman of Heart and Mind, a sublime portrait of a flawed lover. All her emotional barricades, seemingly so often breached, are broken in this song. No defenses, no pretenses. Now I will turn to the final track on the album, which deserves a thorough introduction. It's called Judgment of the Moon and Stars, Ludwig's tune, in parentheses. The Ludwig in question here is Beethoven. In a performance Joni gave on a BBC Two program called Sounds for Saturday, which originally aired on June 10th, 1972, she introduces the song by saying she was originally going to call it Roll Over Beethoven Revisited, but instead just calls it Ludwig's tune. Said she couldn't think of a better title than that. This was obviously before she thought of the title Judgment of the Moon and Stars. She mentions how she'd read a book on Beethoven's spiritual development, saying, "My heart really went out to him, because here he was with all of this genius, and which wasn't really accepted in his time. People thought he was really radical and crazy, and you couldn't do parallel fifths. It just wasn't music, you know? Plus, he was kind of an malleable person and kind of coarse by the standards of the courts in those days, and so, though he had an eye for all the women at the courts, they really didn't have much of an eye for him. So there was another frustration in his life, coupled with the idea that he couldn't even hear some of his final music. Well, you probably know all that, but it really made an impression on me, so I wrote the words to this first, and I waited a long time to put a melody to it because it was just kind of intimidating to write music for old Ludwig." In his biography of Joni, published in 2017, David Yaffe writes about this song, also mentioning the book about Beethoven's spiritual development, which is actually called Beethoven, His Spiritual Development, and which of course I purchased a copy of and instantly devoured. Written by the mathematician, philosopher of science, and amateur pianist J.W.N. Sullivan, and first published in 1927, it's a slender volume of roughly 175 pages, with chapter titles like Art and Reality, Music as Isolated, Music as Expression, The Morality of Power, The Mind of Beethoven, The Hero, Love and Money, God the Companion, and The Final Stage. The blurb on the back of the book, written by Clifton Fadiman, American intellectual, author, editor, and radio and television personality, reads, "It is the most interesting book on music that I have ever read. It deals not only with music, on which I do not speak with authority, but with human life in general, about which you and I speak with authority every day of our lives." I myself cannot emphasize enough how cool Sullivan's book is. If you have any interest in music and or the human condition, you'd be well advised to check it out. Sullivan writes about Beethoven's genius in the most fascinating way. It makes you want to hear all of those sonatas and quartets and what have yous right away. And while I definitely didn't hear what Sullivan heard in those pieces, knowing that he heard them that way greatly enhanced my listening experience. And knowing that Joni Mitchell read Beethoven, His Spiritual Development herself, and was inspired by it enough to write a song about its subject, enhanced my reading experience beyond measure. My favorite parts of the Beethoven book are the excerpts of letters that Beethoven wrote to his friend and to his two brothers. Like Joni's, my heart really went out to him when reading how tortured he was by his hearing loss. This is him at age 30, writing to his doctor friend Franz Wegler. "Oh, if I were rid of this affliction, I could embrace the world. I feel that my youth is just beginning, and have I not always been ill? My physical strength has for a short time past been steadily growing more than ever, and also my mental powers. Day by day I am approaching the goal which I apprehend but cannot describe. It is only in this that your Beethoven can live. Tell me nothing of rest. I know of none but sleep, and woe is me that I must give up more time to it than usual." He says that he cannot endure being so unhappy. Quote, "I will take fate by the throat. It shall not wholly overcome me. Oh, it is so beautiful to live 1,000 times. I feel that I am not made for a quiet life." A few months later, he wrote a letter to his brothers, for them to only read after his death, called the Heiligenstadt Testament, which also served as Beethoven's will. "O ye men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic," he writes, "how greatly do ye wrong me. You do not know the secret causes of my seeming. From childhood my heart and mind were disposed to the gentle feelings of goodwill. I was even ever eager to accomplish great deeds. But reflect now that for 6 years I have been in a hopeless case, aggravated by senseless physicians, cheated year after year in the hope of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady, whose cure will take years or perhaps be impossible. Born with an ardent and lively temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society, I was compelled early to isolate myself, to live in loneliness. When I at times tried to forget all this, oh, how harshly was I repulsed by the doubly sad experience of my bad hearing, and yet it was impossible for me to say to men, "Speak louder, shout, for I am deaf." Ah, how could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which should have been more perfect in me than in others, a sense which I once possessed in highest perfection, a perfection such as few surely in my profession enjoy or ever have enjoyed. Oh, I cannot do it. Therefore, forgive me when you see me draw back when I would gladly mingle with you. My misfortune is doubly painful because it must lead me to my being misunderstood. For me there can be no recreation in society of my fellows, refined intercourse, mutual exchange of thought. Only just as little as the greatest needs command may I mix with society. I must live like an exile. If I approach near to people, a hot terror seizes upon me, a fear that I may be subjected to the danger of letting my condition be observed. Thus it has been during the last year which I spent in the country, commanded by my intelligent physician to spare my hearing as much as possible, in this almost meeting my present natural disposition, although I sometimes ran counter to it, yielding to my inclination for society. But what a humiliation when one stood beside me and heard a flute in the distance, and I heard nothing, or someone heard the shepherd singing, and again I heard nothing. Such incidents brought me to the verge of despair, but little more and I would have put an end to my life. Only art it was that withheld me. Ah, it seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon to produce, and so I endured this wretched existence, truly wretched, an excitable body which a sudden change can throw from the best into the worst state. Patience. It is said I must now choose for my guide. I have done so. I hope my determination will remain firm to endure until it pleases the inexorable parquet to break the thread. Perhaps I shall get better. Perhaps not. I am prepared. Forced already in my 28th year to become a philosopher, oh, it is not easy, less easy for the artist than for anyone else. Divine One, thou lookest into my inmost soul, thou knowest it, thou knowest that love of man and desire to do good live therein. O men, when some day you read these words, reflect that ye did me wrong, and let the unfortunate one comfort himself, and find one of his kind who, despite all the obstacles of nature, yet did all that was in his power to be accepted among worthy artists and men. Beethoven eventually ends this powerhouse of a letter by saying, "Recommend virtue to your children. It alone can give happiness. Not money. I speak from experience. It was virtue that upheld me in misery. To it, next to my art, I owe the fact that I did not end my life by suicide. Farewell, and love each other. With joy I hasten towards death. If it comes before I shall have had an opportunity to show all my artistic capacities, it will still come too early for me, despite my hard fate, and I shall probably wish that it had come later. But even then I am satisfied. Will it not free me from a state of endless suffering? Come when thou will, I shall meet thee bravely. Farewell, and do not wholly forget me when I am dead. I deserve this of you, in having often in life thought of how to make you happy. Be so. Ludwig van Beethoven." When he died about 25 years later, Beethoven did meet his fate bravely. In his last unconscious moments on his deathbed, there was a violent storm outside, and suddenly there was a lightning flash and a great crash of thunder. As Sullivan writes, it seems to have aroused the dying man from his unconsciousness. He raised his clenched fist, opened his eyes, and looked upwards for several seconds with a very serious, threatening expression. As the hand dropped, he fell back dead. Joni Mitchell references this gesture in her song about Beethoven when she sings, "You gotta shake your fist at lightning now." She once told a reporter at the Toronto Star that she could relate to his self-doubts and his worries about how his work was being received and what it all meant on a deeper level. At the time, that's just what I was thinking about too. How am I going to get back in the saddle? And what about the audience? Would you still love me if you knew what I was really like? In his biography of Joni, David Yaffe describes Judgment of the Moon and Stars as Joni's biggest challenge yet. Without classical training, she's going to give Beethoven a tribute from one of the roughs, whose piano had no smooth technique but was as open as the night sky. Even when ears have turned deaf, there is still the muse beyond the music. Joni preferred Beethoven to Mozart, who, when he wasn't at his darkest, sounded too perfect, too courtly, too much, she would say, like wallpaper for princes. Beethoven was the sound of what was rejected by the court. Joni identifies with a man too raw and wild for this world, whose ability to hear is denied him at the peak of his powers. Lawrence Gilbert at the University of Michigan wrote that the song, through the metaphor of Beethoven's struggle against his deafness, comments in a way that reaches home on every individual artist's, and person's for that matter, struggle to realize him or herself. I agree. When Joni sings, you gotta shake your fist at lightning, she isn't just talking to Beethoven. She's talking to anyone who can hear her. Let us lend her our ear now for one last time, with gratitude for being able to do so. Joni Mitchell, closing out her phenomenal album For the Roses by singing to Beethoven, herself, and any other creative soul in the world on the track Judgment of the Moon and Stars, Ludwig's tune. She references Beethoven's deafness in the opening lines. No tongue in the bell and the fishwives yell, but they might as well be mute, so you get to keep the pictures that don't seem like much. She references his loneliness, living without a romantic partner, in the next few lines, my favorites in the song. Cold white keys under your fingers, now you're thinking, that's no substitute. It just don't do it, like the song of a warm, warm body loving your touch. The violin that's so prominent in that track's long instrumental section is played by one Bobby Notkoff, who also played on the album Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere by Neil Young and Crazy Horse, and on Karen Dalton's In My Own Time, among other releases, including a couple by the supergroup Electric Flag. The other personnel on For the Roses, to sum up, were Tom Scott on woodwinds and reeds, Wilton Felder on bass, Russ Kunkel on drums, Bobby Hall on percussion, James Burton on electric guitar in Cold Blue Steel and Sweet Fire, Graham Nash on harmonica in You Turn Me On I'm a Radio, and Stephen Stills as the rock and roll band in Blonde in the Bleachers. Henry Louis provided guidance on sound engineering. Others would say he was the producer, but Joni insists that she only ever had a producer on her first album, and she so disliked the experience, way to go David Crosby, that she decided from there on out that she would be her own producer. But Henry Louis worked with her in a producer-like capacity on For the Roses and on 12 other albums. I've heard their collaboration called one of the greatest of the rock era. Louis also worked with Neil Young, Judy Sill, Joan Baez, Leonard Cohen, Minnie Riperton, and Van Morrison, to name a few. Of Joni Mitchell, he once said, "I'm in love with her. I respect her. She's the only true genius I've ever met." And that's going to do it for this episode of Time and Other Thieves. I'm Sarah B., and I hope you've enjoyed this edited for podcast version of what was originally a 2-part radio show on Asheville FM, all about Joni Mitchell's For the Roses. Take care.